This is Kudus Lawal, teaching statistical concepts with storytelling. Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to dive into a really fascinating puzzle about cause and effect. Have you ever wondered how scientists can confidently say that a certain exposure actually leads to a specific health outcome? Well, it is much harder than it looks. Today, we're unpacking an incredible piece called The Illusory Pursuit of Perfect Randomization. We're going to break down the gold standard of research, the clever little workarounds researchers use when that standard is impossible, and the fatal flaws hidden right inside those workarounds. So let's just dive right in.
To understand complex science, let's start with something super relatable. Imagine we're trying to settle a classic debate. Which chocolate beverage tastes better, Bournvita or Milo? Now, to do this fairly, you can't serve a hot, perfectly mixed mug of Bournvita right next to a lukewarm, watery cup of Milo. That wouldn't make any sense, right? You'd want both served in the exact equal quantity at the exact same temperature, with all other conditions being completely equal. The golden rule of literally any experiment is that the only difference should be the factor you are testing, so in this case, the beverage itself. Every single other variable just has to remain constant.
And you know, this brilliantly illustrates the sheer beauty of the randomized controlled trial, or RCT. In nature, if we just step back and allow events to occur randomly without our interference, they often equilibrate, or naturally balance out, those other factors. Statisticians call these factors confounders. Imagine if we randomly selected 100 beverage makers to prepare 5 grams each of Bournvita and Milo. Because it's completely random, those sneaky confounding factors, like maybe slight variations in water temperature or someone's pouring technique, they're highly likely to just balance themselves out across the two groups. You don't even have to manually manipulate them. That natural balancing act is exactly why the RCT is the undisputed champion of study designs.
But here's where our story takes a bit of a turn. What happens when we're faced with situations where we simply cannot manipulate our groups? We hit these massive ethical or logistical roadblocks. I mean, sure, it's easy to randomize cups of hot chocolate, but what do researchers do when perfect randomization is literally impossible?
Let's raise the stakes a bit. We obviously cannot ethically assign a group of human beings to lead exposure just to see what happens to their health. That is completely out of the question. Instead, researchers are forced to simply observe populations that are already exposed. The source material brings up a very real, very serious scenario of observing communities exposed to lead in the Zamfara gold mines and then comparing them to an unexposed group. We're no longer manipulating the environment, we're just watching it.
And right there, that introduces the ultimate villain of observational studies. When we just observe the Zamfara miners and compare them to non-miners, the selection of those comparators is not random. And because it's not random, all other factors might not automatically balance out like they did with our 100 random beverage makers. People in the mining community might have completely different diets, income levels, or living conditions than the unexposed group. This lack of perfect scientific balance introduces what we call selection bias.
Section 1. Statistical Fixes, Matching and Stratification.
So when confounders start running wild, researchers don't just give up. They turn to their mathematical toolkits to fight back against this selection bias. First up, we have matching. If the groups aren't naturally balanced, we try to force it. We actively attempt to match the groups based on all those other factors. And second, we have stratification. Let's say you're really interested in how lead exposure affects people, but you know age is a huge confounding factor. So you stratify the data. You break it down and look at the effects specifically across different age levels to control for those age-related confounders. It's a highly logical, step-by-step process to manually control those sneaky variables.
But there's a catch, and honestly, it's a huge one. The real world is incredibly messy. As the number of confounding variables goes up, finding a perfect one-to-one match becomes virtually impossible. In reality, the number of factors influencing human health is massively large. You might find a match for age and diet, but what about stress levels or genetics? You very quickly run out of perfect matches.
Section 2. The Propensity Score Solution.
Because simple matching totally falls apart in the real world, statisticians came up with a really elegant workaround, one that actively tries to mimic the magic of true randomization. Just think about the number 10 for a second. Here's how it works. Suppose we identify, measure, and score absolutely all the relevant confounding factors we can find. We combine all of that into one single unified number, the propensity score. If a person exposed to lead in Zamfara has an aggregate propensity score of 10 based on their life factors, we don't need to match all their individual traits anymore. We just find an unexposed individual who also scored a 10. By matching these scores, the two groups differ mainly just in their exposure status.
And from there, researchers built a whole arsenal of techniques to utilize these scores. They used methods like caliper matching, optimal matching, or greedy matching. They can even use propensity scores beyond simple matching, applying them to stratification or something called inverse probability weighting. All of these incredibly complex methods have one single unified goal: to balance the likelihood of being in either group, basically desperately trying to recreate that natural balance of an RCT.
But yeah, it gets tricky again. The propensity score relies entirely on factors we can actually measure, but not all confounding factors can be measured. Just think about this for a second. If we're studying health outcomes in children, how do you mathematically quantify the influence of parental supervision? You can't. It's an unmeasured confounder. And just like that, the presence of these hidden, unmeasured variables completely undermines the otherwise beautiful approach of using propensity scores. The whole mimicry just falls apart.
Section 3. The instrumental variable hack.
When matching fails and propensity scores fall short, researchers pull out this absolute boss-level hack. Let's break down this delicate balancing act. The goal here is to find a variable, the instrument, that is strongly related to lead exposure, but affects the final health outcome, like cancer, strictly through that lead exposure. It cannot have a direct effect on the cancer itself. For instance, researchers might try to use residence in Zamfara as the instrument. Living in Zamfara doesn't directly biologically cause cancer on its own. However, it significantly increases the likelihood of lead exposure, which in turn may lead to cancer. If this holds true, this instrument can actually balance out both known and unknown confounders. Honestly, it's a stroke of genius.
Unfortunately, nothing is completely bulletproof. No instrumental variable has stood the test of time without criticism. And why is that? Because of backdoor variables. Let's think back to our Zamfara residence instrument. What if living in Zamfara is also linked to cancer through a completely different, hidden pathway? Like, say, exposure to mercury used in mining. If that backdoor exists, the connection isn't only through lead exposure anymore. The rule is totally broken, making residence an inappropriate and flawed instrument.
Section 4. The unbeatable original.
So, we've just looked at some massive mathematical gymnastics attempting to recreate a naturally occurring phenomenon. But at the end of the day, they're all just approximations. That brings us to our final, mic drop conclusion directly from the source material. If it's not randomized, it's just not randomization. Pseudos can only try. The randomized controlled trial remains the absolutely undisputed gold standard of scientific inquiry. All our statistical hacks are just illusions of that perfect balance. So the next time you read a flashy headline claiming that X absolutely causes Y, ask yourself, were the groups actually perfectly randomized, or are we just looking at an incredibly clever statistical illusion? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll catch you next time.